Now, this is a rather attractive white Strat, and it's yours, and we've used it a lot. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yes, well, that's a American Standard Strat 2004. It's got elixir strings on it, 12 to 52s with a wound third.
Yes, it has got a wound third. My fingers can attest to this. Great for some things.
Hard to bend.
Just a bit.
It's got CS54 pickups in it, set fairly low and a nice sweet spot. Trim action has got 3 springs on it, which balances the slightly heavier strings nicely. It's not too stiff. The instrument was actually set up by Kevin Reeves, who's Hank's Oz guitar tech. So he did all the fret work for me, and it plays rather nicely.
And it does play very nicely indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the instrument. Now, how do you play it?
Oh, well, Bert Whedon said you could do it in a day. He wasn't quite correct about that. Anyway, with great difficulty, of course. A couple of things to talk about with which a lot of people might know about already, but some might not. Tuning, for a start.
Yes.
I want to talk about tuning a little bit. Some of the sound files we hear lack a little bit in the tuning department.
Yes.
And I'm sure a lot of people do use tuners, but their guitars go out of tune when they play them. This is a problem, I think, for a lot of people. I've had the problem. There are a couple of things to think about. What tends to happen a lot of the time is strings get stuck in the nut, this little bit here. Very often the G string will go sharp. It's quite important to get that nut sorted out by someone who knows how to make the holes, the grooves, the correct size for the strings. If they get stuck, as soon as you waggle the bar, it's going to go sharp. String trees, this isn't a Teflon one. We don't have a problem with it, but that's largely because we've got such heavy strings on it. With lighter strings, I would advise getting a Teflon string tree, and even perhaps a Teflon nut. That's going to help with tuning a lot. Also, when you put strings on, tune them to pitch, tug them. Tune them to pitch again.
Be brutal.
Be brutal, tug them. Hold the guitar here and tug them. With every new string that you put on. Waggle the bar, tug them, tune, until when you tug them, they don't go flat anymore. Because if you don't tug them, as soon as you play them, they are going to go flat, and it's going to destroy your recording or your performance.
Yeah, that's all people hear in the end, isn't it? The flat notes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's such a shame.
Yes.
So that's just a couple of simple things to bear in mind.
Yep. One thing I mentioned in part 1 of the video was the brightness of the pickups.
Yeah.
And I probably should clarify that, lest I gave the wrong impression. CS54s or 5762s are a bright sounding pickup. The pickups in the Oasis Strat are very bright sounding pickups as well.
I thought. Yeah.
The pickups in the original 34-6 are also very bright pickups.
Yeah.
And we've said that's really what you need to get that sound. Now, some people might be thinking, well, I've got a 25-cent cardboard Strat and it's very thin and shrill. That must give me a good shadow sound. I need to just clarify that the cheaper pickups in some of the cheaper guitars sound bright simply because they've got no mid-range and bass.
That's right.
And taming the top end isn't going to give you that shadows mid-range.
Right.
Things like the Oasis Strat or the original or these sorts of guitars have the bright top end, but when that's tamed down, that beautiful juicy mid-range pops out, and that's what gives that sound. Was that a problem originally? Who knows? With the long guitar leads they used in those days, the added capacitance would tame down that brightness. That might have been a factor. It's just one of those many things that we still don't know.
Some of the early Shadows recordings, have you listened to some of Hank's noodling on some of the early Cliff stuff? It is pretty thin.
Yes. And with no due respect to Bruce, but you listen to the rhythm guitars through all the recent concerts which have been recorded, and it's a very bright sound again. It's almost an acoustic type sound, which is possibly
sort of silvery, which is part of his trademark.
And that's what gives it that butte shimmer all the time.
Another problem that people very often have with their tremolo arms is that they rattle in the socket. I've had this in the past. I don't know why Fender don't do something about it and make the connection between the actual arm and the socket that it goes in better than they do, because even if they're tight when you buy them new, you waggle them a few times and they start to clunk. And a lot of people use plumber's tape to wrap round the thread. Hank used that for ages, well, I think for most of the time, until he got an easy mute system. I tried it, I didn't like it. I discovered, quite by accident, that if you take very thin cotton and wrap it around the thread of the arm, you have to experiment with how much cotton to actually put on, and then screw it in. It might be a bit tight to start with, waggle it around a bit, but I find it lasts for months. months and months and months.
Another thing a lot of people don't know is, in fact, in the bottom of the socket there's a little spring. And quite often that falls out.
Yeah, I don't know what that spring's supposed to do. I think perhaps the spring is supposed to tension how much the arm goes this way or not. I don't think it ever works
Stops it
terribly well. It doesn't stop it. No, it doesn't stop it rocking in the socket.
Yes.
For sure. And if people tighten the springs too much, what you wind up with is bits of broken spring
In there. Yeah.
and that's a problem too.
What about the setting of the tone controls and volume? Is there any?
I normally, there are, on the later Fenders, I don't know when they started to do this, but certainly on the early Fenders there was no tone control on the back pickup. And on my one there's no control on it at all. On this one there is, isn't there?
On this one it switches out in the off position in 10, and then it switches in, so you can either run it without a tone or with a tone.
Oh, I see.
If you want
all
to.
right.
Yeah.
Normally, I would have the tone controls full on.
Yes.
I very rarely use them.
Yes.
Very rarely use them. I normally, if possible, would run the volume control flat out
As well.
because you tend to lose, as I'm sure a lot of people know, you tend to lose a little bit of top
Yes.
when you turn it down, which is kind of useful sometimes if you're noodling away in the background
Yes.
behind a singer and you don't want to be too
Don't
much
want
in
it
front.
too
So you
choppy.
could, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there, maybe you can talk about that, I don't know. Is there any way that if you didn't want the volume to lose top when you turn it down, is there any way to fix that?
Well, what happens is, as you turn the volume down, the capacitive loading of the pickup lead starts to influence the sound of the guitar. So it's a fundamental way that these simple volume controls work. It's when we talk about equalisation in just a moment, we'll often be talking about just pulling the top end off a little bit to match the shadow
And I suppose a good way of
sound.
doing that is to actually
That's
turn the
one way
volume
to
down a
do
bit.
it. And people forget they've got tone controls on guitars that they can use.
Yeah.
But a caveat is, in the mixing stage, it's always better to be removing stuff than trying to add it.
Yes.
So if you record it sounding too dull with the tone off too far, it's very hard to get that brightness
Actually,
back
that's a
again.
very hard lesson to learn.
Yes.
Because I've done a lot of recording early on where you top something up, you just whack up the treble.
Yes.
And of course, no professional engineer ever does that.
No,
They
you're always
just don't.
removing rather
Always
than adding.
just take stuff out. It sounds much better.
Yes. Another possible factor that might have influenced the use of those very bright pickups, there's been some conjecture that the Strats back in the late 50s, early 60s were in fact supplied with flat rounds instead of round wound strings. And again, there seems to be some photographic evidence for that. And if that's the case, it could explain why the strings sound so dull on many of those early recordings that we... So they could have been well used, they could have been flat wounds, we don't know. These strings have been on the guitar for well over 6 months. And they've been used a lot.
I think longer than that.
Perhaps a year. They've been used a lot and they've got a lovely dead sound.
They have. They're the sort of strings that, as a session guitarist, I wouldn't normally take to the studio because they really are quite...
That's
well, you
right.
probably can't hear it because it's not plugged in. But they really are quite dead. But it's surprising how well they work for some of the early tuners.
That's right.
Oh, now we come to it. This very attractive and rather dusty box. What is it?
Well, this is the TVS 3 we keep talking about, which is our modern version of a Miazzi drum or tape echo unit.
Yeah.
For those not familiar with it, the way it works, the guitar signal comes in, it's split into a section where the echoes are generated and the magnetic tape saturation and all of that is generated, and then it's all combined together and it comes out. So it's fairly simple. But for each different Shadows tune, there were different characteristic echo patterns and levels of feedback and duration and so on. All of that is stored in memory, in patches, and they're simply called up by pressing the appropriate button on the front panel. There's a little display there, I'll show you later. that tells you what patch you're using.
So in essence, it's a lot easier to use than an actual.
Oh, much easier because you don't have to race away. You can store all the patches for different Echo machines. There's the two Miazis, there's Binsons, there's Ecolets, there's all sorts of machines stored in here.
Yeah.
The knobs on the front, one just lets you have the normal Miazi input, or there's another position which gives you some bass cut because a lot of the Shadows tunes were cut in the bass. There's the all-important level knob. As we've said, if you drive it at low levels, the echoes will be clean, distinct.
That level knob is not necessarily for the volume of the guitar. Might explain that a bit.
Very good point. It's not a volume control.
Yeah.
Your amplifier is the volume control.
Yeah.
This sets the drive level going into the unit. And at low levels, you get a clean guitar signal, clean echoes. As you slowly wind it up, you start getting more thickening of the dry guitar signal, you get more compression of the echoes, and you get a thicker sound in general, right up to quite thick. Then, because of different playing styles and different venues, while all the information about the echo amplitudes is stored in the patch in memory, for different players, some pluck the strings hard, some plucked it soft, and that changes the apparent echo level. So you can adjust the level of the echoes from the front panel, you can adjust the duration also from the front panel. If you leave them on roughly 4 or 5, then you get the default settings, which will be suitable for most people. There's an indication here of the level so that you can in fact know if you're running it with only the green LEDs operating, then it's working fairly clean. If the yellow LED's starting to flicker, you're starting to thicken up the sound. If you're driving it into the red, you'll really be getting a thick sound with very compressed echoes. Only remaining thing to say, I guess, is that on the back there's a couple of connectors. There's one for a foot switch so that in a live environment you can select and change patches, and I'll talk about that a bit more right at the very end when we talk about live performance setups. There's another output if you want to have this rack mounted. There's also an output which is the echo only output.
So when you're recording, you could in fact record the echo on a separate track, which is very useful sometimes.
It's very useful because it's very hard to get the echo levels right, and unless you're going to play the tune 20 times and each time adjusting the level just a little bit, it's very hard to tell until you actually hear the final mix whether they're the right level or not. The difficulty with that though is you don't get the echoes recombining with the dry signal in the unit itself, so you lose a lot of the character. So the preferable way is to run it normally and just have maybe 1 or 2 takes to get the
When Hank used it, did he do it that way, or did he have it separate?
When Hank used it, no, he used it just with the normal input and output, but he had a technician sitting backstage who was selecting patches for him for each
Well, I meant
tune.
actually from a recording point of view.
From a recording point of view. No, he actually used it just as the normal system again, because that gives the best sound. And that's why I did it that way.
So, Paul, this is your amplifier, which you made with your own 2 hands. Looks rather similar to something. Explain.
Yes, well, it's a clone of an AC-15. But it incorporates 2 different channels. There is the normal AC-15 channel, which has got an EF86 preamp valve in it, but I've also got a switchable tone network, so you can either run it as a straight AC-15 or you can use it as it would sound for the vibrato or tremolo channel of an AC-15, which has extra bass cut, and I suspect they use that sometimes. You can also use it as at the brilliant setting, which the 3rd model AC-15s had as an option.
So this is the 3-in-1.
So that's the 3 AC-15s in one, and also the AC-34 basically in one. But there's more. There's more.
What?
It's also got a conventional Vox type top boost channel, which has got a 12AX7 preamp valve in it, but it's got the separate treble and bass controls just as the top boost function of the Vox amp, and also of course there is the cut control that affects either channel that you're using. So with this one amp we can set it up to be any of the early AC-15s, the AC-34, the AC-36 and the AC-36 top boost. So we can use this to cover all of the Shadows tunes.
Pretty versatile.
Yes.
Is there anything on the market other than this that's like this, that's as versatile as this is?
Well, some of the Vox amplifiers of the 15-watt category do in fact have a top boost channel as well as this. But there's one thing I would say, I guess, to aspiring AC-15 and indeed AC-30 fans, is because of the circuit and the way it's arranged, there's no feedback around the output transformer. What that means is that the sound that it generates is critically dependent on two things. One is the output transformer.
Yeah.
And you can get an output transformer for these things for $30, or you can get them for $400. And I didn't think there'd be much difference till I put a Mercury Magnetics output transformer in, and it transformed it from being rather thin and brittle sounding to producing the sound that you'll hear on the sound files now. It was a really good investment.
Yeah.
The second thing is the loudspeaker.
Yeah.
This one has got an English Celestian Blue in it. They're a fairly expensive loudspeaker, but they're very good, and they were as fitted to the middle range period of the Voxes. The early ones had Goodmans, but I don't have one of those. But there are some other speakers which are clones of the Celestian Blue, which are also very good and much less expensive. One of which I've personally tried is the Weber Blue Dog. It's an Alnico speaker. It's got the blue frame, it looks just like it, and it sounds very, very close, and it's only about a third or half the price. So.
Now, you wanted to clarify something about amplifiers on the gear sheet that we showed last time.
Yeah, indeed, a number of things on the gear sheet, some questions people have raised. The gear sheet simply shows what equipment was available, or we know was available at what time.
Yeah.
Whether they used that specific equipment on a specific track, we don't know, because there might have been a changeover period as well. But it's there for indicative purposes. Another interesting thing, of course, is when the top boost first came in on the Vox amps. After they went from the AC15 to the first AC30, was the 34 that didn't have top boost. They then went to the 6-channel version, the 36, and the first of those didn't have top boost either.
Right.
And the top boost was first manufactured as an add-on during 1961. I've indicated that top boost starts fairly early in 1961, and that's based purely on listening to the tracks and trying to match the tracks as well. But in fact, we don't know exactly when it was first used. We do know there was a circuit diagram that had a date on it around October 61, but Vox were notorious for not producing circuit diagrams till well into the production run. So Hank could have easily had one quite early in 1961, and indeed in the little book that they produced called The Shadows by Themselves, which was published in 1961, he refers to his amp being souped up by Vox 4ing with the top boost unit. So we know he had it, and probably fairly early, I would guess, in 1961.
In order to get, we covered this a little bit in the first video, but in order to get that early sound, is it imperative to have a Vox?
It's not imperative, but it certainly helps you get there.
On the amp, why do the different channels sound different?
Yeah, good question, which again many people have asked. I've got in front of me some frequency response curves for the channels, just show how they affect the music coming into the amplifier, which we'll show as a direct vision. But basically, the normal channel of the amplifier is quite flat in frequency response. What you feed in is what comes out, basically. The top boost channel, however, as I mentioned in video 1, puts a dip in the mid-range, and the depth of that dip depends upon how you set the treble and bass controls.
They're interactive.
They're very interactive, and it takes a little bit of experience to actually set them up. And in a moment when we talk about equalisation, part of the equalisation that we use is simply to correct for wrong settings that we've used on the amplifier, because we don't know how they were set up. Fender.
Which brings us, can you get this sound out of different amplifiers? What about people who've got either Marshalls or Fenders? A lot of people have got Fenders. Can they get the shadow sound out of a Fender?
They can get close. The tone controls work differently, but they produce the same effect with that dip in the mid-range. That's what people found makes guitar sound good. A bit of...
I've always found Fender sound particularly choppy compared to Vox.
They tend to. Two other things about Fenders and Marshalls and so on. The loudspeakers in them are voiced to sound different to a Vox loudspeaker, but it gets you very close. And I think throughout this video, the important thing is making music's meant to be fun. Having fun, making fun.
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean if you haven't got a Fiesta Red Strat and a Vox and an AC15 and a TVS 3, you can't have fun. Don't let that stop you.
So Paul, in relation to recording, what type of microphone would you recommend?
Well, we use a a Shure SM57 Spiro because it's fairly much an industry standard for miking up guitar amps. It's not the same that they used in the early days of Abbey Road. They used condenser microphones which had different characteristics. But those microphones are very expensive. We can't afford them, so we use one of these. It's got a bit harder sound. It's not quite as sweet as the other ones, but it's certainly very adequate, as you'll see from the sound files.
Yeah. So mic placement is very important.
Yes, absolutely. And as we said in part one of the videos, it's one of your best tone controls, and we'll demonstrate that when in a little while we get on to the various tunes.
So you're making a lot of noise playing your guitar.
Yeah.
And what are the neighbours going to say?
Yeah,
what do we do about the neighbours, Paul?
Yeah, that's a very good. Very good. You've obviously had neighbour trouble.
Our neighbours actually like it, but some neighbours don't.
Yeah,
so for those who don't, what do we do?
It's a real issue because to get the sound right, quite often you have to drive the amplifier quite hard, and even with the 15 watt amplifier, it can be a problem.
Yep.
At home, I don't have a fancy studio. We don't use fancy studio equipment. I actually have my loudspeaker separate to the head unit, and that actually goes in our walk-in robe. My wife has a large number of dresses, and the walk-in robe is a lovely dead recording environment. So that's how I get over the noise problem. But
there is another way.
There are other ways. I mean, you can actually replace the loudspeaker with a dummy load, and the better of those actually reproduce the way the speaker loads the amp. Just putting resistive loads in doesn't do that. And so that then gives you a signal without the noise of a loudspeaker that you can feed into your mixer or to your computer and get a sound.
Okay.
It's not as good as miking up a real amp and a real loudspeaker because, as I said earlier on, the loudspeaker actually is a key part of producing the sound. But also these days you can get some quite good amp modelling software that you can use on your computer, or separate standalone amp modelling boxes, which go a long way to giving that realistic sound.
Okay.
And as we said earlier on, I mean, if you're after the last 1 or 2%, then you need to record through the amp and the speaker. But at the end of the day, it should be about fun and enjoying what you're doing.
Yeah, sure.
And if you have a noise problem, then it's far better to be doing it with a dummy load and direct injection into the computer and headphones and making music than not doing it at all. That really is the critical thing.
There are a lot of people who like to record from home and record into their computer, direct to the computer. Have you got any tips for people recording at home on their computer?
Yeah, well, that leads us, I guess, into the next part of our chain when we're recording it. The microphone output we take to a simple, cheap mixer. It's nothing fancy at all.
Yep, I do too, yeah.
Yep, there's just a way of balancing the gain of the microphone. And the output from that goes into the computer.
Yep.
Now, I use a fairly cheap sound card. It's just an Audigy 2 going into a PC. You can get more elaborate and more expensive interfaces to go into the computer. And indeed, I would recommend doing that if you're setting up from scratch. So it's fairly important to have either a good sound card or a good audio interface, and that then gets your signal into the computer.
Okay, so you've got your echo set, your signals are going into your computer, you've done your recording.
Yep.
What do we do then?
Well, how we do the recording, I guess, is the next thing. You need some recording software, and there's some of that's freely available as shareware. We happen to use a program called Samplitude Music Studio. It's not expensive. It costs about $150, I think, when I last looked, but it gives all the functionality of a proper digital audio workstation. Yep. You can do all the recording and editing. You can put in plugins and all that sort of thing to make it work. The way we do it is we have the backing track on one of the channels, and we'll show you what the screen looks like with the backing track on. You then hit the record button, the computer plays the backing track through some loudspeakers so that you can hear it. You play along, it gets recorded on another track, and so on the computer you have your backing track, you have your recorded track, you then mix those two together to get the final product.
Okay, great. So basically, Paul, once we've done the recording, we basically want to do as best we can what Malcolm did back in the old days.
Yes.
Is to EQ the recording, our track.
Yep.
Okay, so how much compression do we have to work on? How much reverb? What else do we do? There's reverb, compression, distortion. We don't equalisation.
Yeah. Yes, I mean the objective we're trying to achieve, of course, is to sound like the original. And one of the questions we need to address is, well, how much did they do back in the days when Malcolm was in Studio 2 at Abbey Road? And
because we don't have the studio facilities that they had back then.
No, we don't. And indeed, we don't know what they did. Malcolm has been interviewed and asked this question a number of times, and he generally starts off saying, well, they had minimal interference in the sound. Basically, they recorded it. But then again, in other interviews, he mentioned they had some difficulties with the Neumann U47 mics that they used. And in fact, they had to equalise the signal to get it sounding like they wanted it to sound.
Okay.
And in other interviews, he goes on to say that on the red desk that they used for mixing at Abbey Road, each channel, in fact, had a Pultec peaking equaliser as well. So we know they had that equipment. We also know they had very good compressors, valve-based compressors, either Fairchild or EMI Specials. So what we try and do is guess at what they might have done and use equipment appropriate to that period to get the right sound. We accept those constraints. Now, if we talk first of all about equalisation, I guess there's three aspects. First of all, did they use equalisers on the sound or not? We simply don't know. They're available for them to use. They mentioned that they used them on the Neumann microphones, which were in use up till about 1962, but we don't know how much or what or anything.
Yeah.
We know that they used a Pultec type peaking equaliser, and there were two common Pultecs available to studios at the time. There was the PEQ1, which was the shelving equaliser, and I gather they used that mainly in the classical recording studios. The main peaking one was one called the MEQ5, which let you put a low frequency peak in and a high frequency peak, and actually you could suck out some of the mid-range as well. I don't know which they used, but we base our equalisation on the capabilities of the MEQ5.
So we just use the Samplitude facility, plug-in or whatever it is?
There's two ways we can do this. We have an MEQ5 plug-in which we can use. Sometimes it's quicker just to use a parametric equaliser, and most recording software has parametric equalisers that you can call up. And when we talk about this particular tunes, again, I'll show you the sort of equalisation that we use. But interestingly, it's very much similar to the amplifier tone control profiles. All we're really doing is tweaking it. So that's the first thing. We don't know what equalisation they used, and we're trying to guess at that. The second thing is we don't know what settings they used on their amplifier, and we're again only guessing. So we're using equalisation possibly to adjust for the fact that we've got different amp settings to them, just making small adjustments. The third thing is some of the tunes that they've recorded, you can't get the bass cut and the treble cut with amplifier tone controls and mic placement alone. So we know that on some tunes they most certainly did bring in some extra equalisation as well.
So how do you know when you've reached that point where you've finished?
When you go mad, I think is the answer. The best instrument you've got to do is, because there's no point us saying this is the equalisation curve you use for Wonderful Land, because it depends entirely on your setup, your amplifier, how you've set up the tone controls.
And each tune's individually different.
Each tune's different, the speaker, the recording environment. At the end of the day, you have to judge it by your ear.
Yep.
And how do I set up equalisation? Well, it's not hard, but it takes quite a bit of practice.
Yep.
When we recorded a tune, and we'll show you examples of the as recorded material, the first thing I then do is listen to the top end. Is the guitar sounding brighter than the original Shadows tune we're trying to match? If it is, I then bring the top down a little bit, just bring some top cut. The next thing I do is listen to the bottom end of the guitar, the lower notes. Are they sounding fatter and more bassy than the tune we're trying to match? If they do, I bring in some bass cut. I'll then go back to the top and the bass just till I've got that general tone profile right. Then you listen to the mid-range. And As recorded, the sound might be sort of a bit reedy and a bit, the word that comes to mind is rounded and plummy sounding compared to the shadows. Quite often the shadows had a scooped sound in the mid-range.
Yes.
So I then adjust the mid-range to get that right level of scooping so that it sounds right. That gets you in the ballpark. You then really need to run off a trial mix, do a direct comparison over various segments of the tune with the original material, and you'll invariably hear that your bass isn't quite right, or your top end's not quite right, or the mid isn't quite right. You go back, adjust the equaliser, do another mix, and go through a few loops till you get that sounding right. You mentioned also reverb and compression. Most of the tunes we do have very little compression. You can use it to adjust note levels, but generally I don't think a lot of the Shadows' early tunes had compression. There are obvious examples like Apache, It's Been a Blue, Blue Day, Lost City in the Burns era, where there was obviously a lot of compression on the guitar. The important thing with the compression is a lot of people use compressor pedals and things, but unfortunately that technology's, in my view, not up to the job. In the studio at Abbey Road, Studio 2, they had access to a couple of valve-based compressors. One was a Fairchild 660, which was one of the model numbers, and the other was one of their modified Altec compressors. Was really an EMI special. But the characteristic thing of their compressors is they could get a very fast, what's called attack time. The compressor responds very quickly to the note coming in, so it doesn't clip off that very important transient when you first play. In terms of figures, the Fairchild you can set up with an attack time as low as 0.2 of a millisecond. Most of the pedals you get have much longer attack times, and they notably colour the sound. The other important thing, or there are two other important things with the compressor. One is then the decay time or the delay time. The Fairchild had quite a long delay time, which was again adjustable, but it's around 300 milliseconds. The other thing is the compression ratio that you use, and you really need to adjust that to get the sound right on the system.
But for people who haven't got the access to that type of equipment, what is a shortcut solution?
Great question. I mean, to buy a Fairchild 660 or 670 compressor, you probably need to mortgage the house. They're very expensive pieces of vintage equipment. Just as
we'll get a bigger house to fit it in.
Yeah, I'll get a very understanding wife. We use a plug-in. The plugins we use, again, they're not expensive. They're in the $100, $200 Australian category, and they're very good investments.
But most of the compressors you get on most software, can they get you by?
If you can adjust them for that very quick attack time. If you can't, then they simply are not useful for getting the Atlantis sound. And there's a lot of shareware stuff out there as well. So, I mean, your question is very pertinent. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars on equipment to start getting into this area. The final thing that you mentioned earlier on was reverb. Studio 2 tended to use just a single reverb chamber at Abbey Road, which was an L-shaped room. It was roughly 12 feet by 25 feet. It had reinforced concrete floors and ceilings, brick walls, and some ceramic tubes about 12 inches diameter scattered throughout the room with paving stones on top to stop them resonating to get the reverb. And they had a loudspeaker in one end of the room and a microphone in the other, and that was their reverb system. Unless you've got a lot of money and build that into your house, we again use a reverb plug-in. We actually use what's called a convolution reverb called Altiverb, which is based on realistic sound environments. Again, it doesn't matter if you use that particular one or not. We don't use a lot of reverb on our recordings. Some Abbey Road recordings was obvious, but a lot of them it was very subtle. And a big mistake is to go for too much of these effects. It really spoils the core tone.
So the idea is to make sure that you record as little as possible of the sound effects till after you're recording.
Exactly, and really it underlies you've got to get the core tone in your raw recording. If that's not there, no amount of this fiddling around is going to produce. The key thing with reverb is at Abbey Road, to feed the signal into the reverb chamber, they fed it first into a tape recorder to delay the sound, and this is now called pre-delay. And you need a pre-delay of around about 50 milliseconds, otherwise it clutters up the sound. So whatever sort of reverb you use, whatever sort of plug-in, it's fairly important that you can set the pre-delay so that's about 50 and adjust the other parameters to be suitable for a sort of about a 12 by 20 type room. In Altiverb, again, you can set up those room parameters and you can match that fairly closely. As Malcolm said, if you send the full signal into the reverb room, it gets very muddy. The bass notes just muddy everything up. So they send it through a bandpass filter, cutting off the low end at about 600 hertz and the top end at about 8 to 10,000 hertz. So you don't get that muddiness coming through all the time. And again, if you can set up your reverb system in your computer to have that bass cut, that's very important.